Alistair, lovely to see you. Mel, as always, my co-host. What a joy. And Hilary's now back.
Hi.
What a delight to have all of you discussing codependency tonight. Something that all of us know very little about. That was a joke.
That's why I'm laughing, Lou. That's why I'm laughing.
I think I put in my post earlier that in my old days at the Priory, we had a quiz on codependency. I'm not sure if I've shared this with any of you. And you had to go through a number of questions. And unfortunately, I came out as chronic. So chronic codependent. There's me fessing up at the beginning.
Yeah.
Alistair, would you like to just say a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure, I'm Alistair Richardson. I specialise in treating addiction and trauma and codependency, which we're going to be discussing today. And, you know, I use energy psychology with that as well. But I'm also in recovery from addiction and codependency. So it's also a personal thing, not just professional for me.
Lovely. And lovely to have you with us in the group. And I'll just say I've spent the last 3 days or 3 days last week with Alistair doing some amazing EFT tapping training. So thank you for that. It was excellent. Hilary, you're back. Is there something interesting underneath the desk?
I have battery issues. I'm not sure. I've got a new laptop, so I'm a bit all over the place with it, but hopefully you can hear me.
Yes.
And thank you for inviting me to be here this evening. I was saying to you earlier, I actually really found out about codependency through my own sort of self-development, really. And in about 1997, I started going to Codependents Anonymous, which is a mutual help group. And I didn't really know anything about it then. And I wasn't a counsellor at the time, so I just didn't know anything about anything. So that was my start. And when I became a counsellor, I did lots of training, but I heard about Pia Melody's work with codependence, and I'd read a lot of her books in America, and she was doing something at the Meadows called post-induction therapy training. So I was lucky enough to go out there in 2006 and bring back her work, really. It's called Survivors at the Meadows, and we bought a sort of our version of it at the Priory, and I ended up working with Alistair there, which was brilliant. And we went on to do our own workshops outside externally, and it's very much part of my work. It's part of my life, really, and the way I live, but it's also part of my work. So I'm a big fan of recovery for codependence. It's a sort of quite a hidden and, you know, very problematic you know, set of issues to deal with. So I hope I can be of some help tonight.
Well, I'm sure you both will be, and Mel and I are delighted that you've joined us. I mean, both of you are legendary, I would say, in the field of addiction and codependency recovery. And I've known about you for a very long time. So I'm just really grateful for you giving up your time tonight and coming into the group, and hopefully shedding some light for others that know less about it, what it is really. Maybe that's a good place for us all to start. What is codependency? What do we mean by it? Who wants to go first? Alistair, maybe?
Sure. So codependency for me, I normally say it's a dysfunctional relationship with yourself and others caused by childhood trauma, relational trauma, dysfunctional parenting and abuse. Now, a dysfunctional relationship with self, so it's a healing and reparenting model, you know, what I do post-induction therapy. So affirming a child is functional parenting, criticizing and attacking a child is dysfunctional. So a dysfunctional relationship with myself, I'll be criticizing and attacking myself rather than being able to affirm myself. Abandoning and neglecting a child is dysfunctional parenting. nurturing the child is functional. So again, can I nurture myself, or do I abandon and neglect myself?
Okay.
And then can I set myself healthy limits, or do I indulge? Again, so that's why I ask people to find out if they're codependent. Do you criticize yourself too much? Do you indulge? Do you abandon and neglect yourself? So that's, my first response to that.
Okay, so that's what codependency is for you. Hilary, would you agree? Does it mean the similar for you, or have you got a slightly different definition?
Yes, I do. Yes, I agree with Alistair. There's so many ways to describe this, and if you Google it, there's hundreds of definitions. I tend to stick with what Pia Melody says about it, because I did most of my training with her. And, it's a bit strong to say the word disorder, but she describes it as a developmental disorder of immaturity caused by relational trauma. And it has 5 primary symptoms, which Alistair was talking about. And it's sometimes difficult for people to think about. Often people say to me, well, I had a wonderful childhood, but there's often difficulties going on in the family because the parents are immature and they really haven't got the skills to parent correctly, and it causes all sorts of problems. So when I say to people I work as an addiction and trauma therapist, and I say the word trauma, they think of very abject abuse, and sometimes it is that, but sometimes it's very covert and hidden, and it's more difficult for the person that has those symptoms to understand that something's happened to them. And we were talking earlier, and Mel was talking about the codependency and the counterdependency. And so there are people who are very who are under functioning and feel very less than, and there are people who are very over functioning and who are very better than, and are quite sort of arrogant and grandiose and judgmental. And they're very often the people that don't think they've got anything wrong with them. They don't think they're immature, but actually they're operating somewhere between about 7 years old and 12-year-old. They might be very intellectually bright, but they're really immature, and that's because they've had immature parents.
Yeah.
And so it really comes about codependency. The survival traits, the dysfunctional symptoms are because they've come from a dysfunctional home.
Okay. Mel, have you got anything to add to that you want to say at this point?
Yeah, I think, codependency has been, it was a revelation for me when I found out about codependency, I have to say. And it was kind of one of those really bittersweet moments where I was like, oh my God. And then I was like, hallelujah. It was finally, I sort of understood.
Makes sense. Yeah.
I kind of understood so much more about why I struggled, not just in romantic relationships, but the relationships that I had with my family, why I was kind of crashing up against this feeling all the time of, for me, my codependency comes in the form of needing to please, needing to make sure everybody is okay. It's that whole you're okay if I'm okay if you're okay. That's one of the big ways that I describe codependency when I'm working with clients is, if you're okay, I'm okay, and I can't be okay if you're not okay. And that's very much how my codependency plays out, that need to be the perfect daughter, partner, friend. And it's kind of a bit like, sometimes I liken it to superhero tendencies, but I don't have this, or I didn't have what I needed to kind of refuel when I was going out and saving the world. So there was me with my cape on, going out and trying to save the world, but having nothing to fill my own tank up. So I would end up burning, crashing, and actually really, really resentful, not understanding why people weren't doing the same for me as I was doing for them.
Yeah.
So that's kind of, a little bit about how, I see codependency, because that's how it played out for me. So that's a bit about my experience. I just wanted to, say very quickly, Oriel has asked a question in the group, and we will come back to questions at the end, Oriel, so please don't think we're ignoring you. I've seen it, I've acknowledged it, and we will come back to questions a little bit later.
Okay, so we've started on the symptoms of codependency, but can we elaborate a bit more on some of the symptoms? Like, how do we know that we're codependent? What are some of the warning signs, would you say?
Want to go first, Alistair?
Okay, so self-esteem issues, so either feeling less than others, worth less, or better than others, which makes people very controlling of other people. Either they're controlling in a dominant way, so they feel valuable enough, like you have to see me the way I want you to, so I feel good enough, or submissively controlling, so people pleasing, covert, you know, I'll change myself to keep you happy, so you love me, so I feel valuable enough. Whereas really we're looking for healing in terms of inherent worth. You know, I have inherent worth. It cannot be raised by my strengths or lowered, you know, by my defects of character. You know, problems with boundaries, self-protection, and being offensive to others. You know, problems with knowing and expressing your thoughts and feelings in a reality in a way that doesn't overwhelm other people. Not having walls between you and other people. Difficulty with self-care. So either not asking for help when you really need help and you know you need help, or being too needy and dependent on others, like you're a little child still.
Yeah.
Or the other one escapes me right now. I'm sure Hilary will mention it in a minute. And, you know, difficulty with moderation and containment. So being able to be spontaneous and open, but also with moderation and knowing how you're affecting other people. Yeah, so they're the main core issues, and it just damages intimacy in relationships. You know, it causes dishonesty. It causes people to be either too enmeshed with people, like I need you, too needy, or too avoidant of other people.
Yeah.
You know, turning to addictions to medicate emotions, rather than being able to know and express our needs and wants and things like that. So really damages communication with people. Also a big one, the last one I mentioned for now, is people have a perception of reality, what's going on, which goes through their filters of their beliefs that they've taken on in childhood often, which may be distorted, but go off like, when you ignored me earlier, when you abandoned me. And it's like, well, no, I didn't abandon you. That's not at all what's going on. So, you know, so there's some of the main symptoms.
No, brilliant. Okay, I recognise a few of those.
Oh,
Historically, obviously. Hilary, do you want to add to anything to that? Any more that would come up for you?
I think Alistair's described it very well. But it's a very difficult thing, you know, to kind of, you know, a lot of people ask that question, you know, how do I know that I'm codependent? And, you know, I often get them before they even start working in therapy with me to read Pia Melody's book, Facing Codependence, because she describes the problems very well. Both, yes, as Alistair says, the very sort of less than boundaryless, feeling bad, very dependent, out of control person, but also the very better than, walled in, I'm good and perfect, anti-dependent, needless, wantless, super in control person. These are all the symptoms. And again, it's often baffling to people. And one of the biggest signs that I can tell as a sort of test for whether people have you know, are experiencing symptoms and they don't know what's wrong, and they say, you know, I just don't really know who I am. I feel lost. And I think, you know, I've brought my little picture here. I don't know if anybody will be able to see it. There, people that know me will laugh because I always show this little drawing, and you see it's like there's like a little kid inside you, and then there's a sort of a teenager that an adapted child that copes to look after the little one. And usually with the symptoms, people are operating out of these two, not their adult, because they don't really know how to be an adult.
Yes.
And the adapted adult child is like a teenager. It's like a teenager who's a fake. And this is why people really aren't connected to themselves. They're just not connected. And that really is, for me, a big sign that the person is suffering from, you know, these issues from childhood developmental trauma.
Yeah.
And I
And
think,
you know, quite often I use with people, just to get their heads around it to start with, you know, that TA model where we've got the functional adult and actually we've got the critical parent and the not okay child. And the critical parent can sometimes be the teenage part that is like, go away, you know, I don't want you near me.
Yes.
That is adapted to look after that younger part. And, you know, lots of the time, are you in that adapted or that teenage, or can you bring yourself back to that real self? And often, as we know, all of us, well, I'm sure, you spend so much of your time adapting as a child to fit in or be a chameleon or please or get love or whatever it is that we're all trying to do, that you lose that sense of who you are anyway. So some of the fear of recovery of codependency is about, bloody hell, who am I actually without it? You know, because you've lost that touch, that connection with yourself, haven't you?
And I think for me, a really important part of understanding and being able to heal from codependency was the understanding that I could be both, that I could be the codependent and I could be the counter-dependent. And I remember, can't even remember if it was one of you guys when I did the trauma workshop, or whether it was when I was in treatment, but somebody having this really amazing description for me about the counter-dependent, because what I couldn't understand is why it wasn't good to be the counter-dependent. Like, surely, you know, it's an okay thing to kind of be the one that's, you know, managing and coping and, you know, to be seen to be. And the way that someone described it to me is that the codependent is like the rock almost, and the counter-dependent kind of sits on top of the rock. And then when the codependent starts to move away from the counter-dependent, when they start their healing journey, what then happens is the counter-dependent falls flat on their face, because they are reliant on the behavior of the codependent to kind of keep their behaviors going. And when somebody described it like that to me, that as a counter-dependent falling flat once the codependent moves away, again, you know, that was another thing that just made so much sense to me.
But the way you know, another way of saying something similar, you know, because I think we're going to talk about, you know, at some point, what is compulsive helping and is it part of codependency? And a guy called Robert Lefebvre first came up with that saying, you know, that description of compulsive helping, and he described it as the need to be needed. And people are either, you know, doing self-denial, they're helping themselves, other people to their own detriment, or they're dominantly caretaking other people. Now, to me, that's set up in childhood, where you might get people in the hero role. So you learn to feel valuable by looking after other people, not having self-esteem. So at the Priory, literally, people who had that strongly would put them on a helping ban sometimes, so they wouldn't even be allowed to open the door for someone. And the first thing that, because they're in there adapted when they're doing that hero, rescuing everyone's stuff to make themselves feel valuable, they've got their radar on. So first thing, they'd get angry, like, what do you mean? It's just common courtesy to open the door for someone. It's good manners and all this stuff. And we wouldn't even let them make a tea for someone. They'd have to ask someone else to make them a tea. But what would happen then is they would fall flat on their face, like you say. They'd go into their wounded child, they'd go into their trauma, that adaptation, that was their way of parenting that or medicating that they learned to grow up, you know. So it's functional when they're growing up, but when you take that away, up comes the wound, you know, and then it's available, you know, you're available to do the healing there.
Yeah. It's kind of covering the wound, isn't it? Almost.
Yeah.
Obliterating it. Yeah. Yeah. So what do we think the causes are of codependency? I know we touched on it, or Hilary touched on it earlier, but what do we think causes it? Is it immaturely, or parents with developmental issues, or addiction, or, I mean, it used to be called co-addiction, didn't it, in the early days, and then it became codependency because they they recognized it was part of the addictive process, and people that were co-addicts or codependents were normally in relationship with addicts. But what do we think causes it underneath it all? What is relational trauma, I guess I'm asking?
Well, you know, without talking, you know, too technically, I think it's when the bonding between a parent and a child is disrupted or interrupted in some way, you know.
Yeah.
And we call it less than nurturing. A lot of people freak out when we say abuse, because it's often been enmeshing abuse or false empowerment, where a child has been put on a pedestal or been made the parent of the family. And, you know, to the child, it all seems rather marvelous. But, you know, parenting isn't happening at that point, and it harms the child. And, you know, mum and dad are there to help shape the child into the teen, into the adult. So for me, it's a disruption in that bonding. It's a disruption in the parenting, and you know, it fails to, the parents fail. And Pia Melody always says, you know, sometimes it isn't sort of malicious or intended, but the child isn't nurtured, isn't esteemed properly, and isn't taught limits or boundaries, as we call them.
Yeah.
And this causes all sorts of problems. This is the you know, it's you know, I often meet families, and to the outside world they look absolutely fabulous, you know, sometimes very high profile people, but you know, the family is severely dysfunctional, and this, you know, it goes back generationally oftentimes. So that's what I think causes codependency. What about, and it's not,
yeah, well, it's not about blaming parents at all. They do the best they can in almost every case. Yeah. It's just about what's the impact of the parenting, and you know, it's about truth and love, is what Pia Melody says. How can we heal from it, you know? So for example, around emotions, for example, if the parents are shut down from their emotions, then they abandon their child emotionally. How can they nurture their child if they don't know how to feel and express sadness appropriately or functionally? And all of our feelings have a positive purpose, like anger to empower us and maybe protect ourselves, fear to run away, you know, if we need to. So, you know, if we're not, or if someone's got an addiction in the family, or, you know, there's abandonment. And so there's 4 types of emotion. Let's just say anger as an example. There's our here and now feeling reality, thinking and feeling reality. Then we've got empathy, where we can sense other people's emotions. Like a mass panic's a kind of heavy example of that, where we get swamped by other people's emotions. Then we've got our inner child feelings. So if I was 7 and it wasn't you know, I wasn't able to show my emotions for whatever reason, or I wasn't nurtured, I'm just going to suppress them. So they're still in there as an adult until I do some sort of healing around that. So something happens now, I might feel like 7-year-old me again. I've regressed. So I've got my adult feelings, my little 7-year-old feelings. But the 4th one is called a carried emotion. And this is where the parents are either overindulging in emotion, like they're raging, or they're suppressing anger, they're weeping all the time, or they're never sad in their house, you know, or they're shameless, they don't feel any shame or guilt, and they never apologize for anything, or they're too filled with that stuff. The child soaks it up, you know, and so in the here and now, part of the healing is learning, what's my feeling in the here and now, what's my inner child's feeling who needs some help and healing, and what do I need to give back that was never mine, that's come down through the generations, as Hilary says, you know. So that, you know, it's the immaturity, it's the parents not knowing how to handle their emotions and be nurturing and have that healthy bond, which is, you know, that's what they learned growing up, isn't it? So, you know what, Alistair, you've just sort of triggered that memory for me from when I did yours and Hilary's workshop a few years ago. And for me, learning what was the carried stuff and what wasn't was such a massive turning point for me in my healing, in my recovery, in my trauma recovery. Because when I understood that I was, you know, I was given
that stuff. It wasn't mine. And when I learned a way to be able to give it back, that was instrumental in my recovery. It really was. Lovely. In my recovery from codependency, especially.
Yeah, lovely. A question that gets asked quite a lot that I'm going to throw into the mix now is codependency a disease?
Do you want to go first, Hilary?
Well, it's not officially recognised by the psychological community as a disease, and you know, in the addiction world, you know, I often have heated debates with professionals from other fields, and you know, I've learned over the last sort of over 20 years that it's best not to get into debates about it. You know, I rather like to think of it as a disease, and I think in the early literature of Pia Melody's literature that was written in the 70s, she says that the core symptoms are the adult manifestation of the disease of codependence. So I sort of see addiction as a disease. It goes in stages. It's well documented that we sometimes talk in that way in addiction treatment, and we talk about chemical addiction as a disease, and I think it's a good model, but it's not officially recognized as a disorder or a mental illness, and most people describe it as a rather unique psychological construct that shares significant overlaps with other psychiatric problems.
Yeah.
It usually scares the living, you know, daylights out of people when I say that. So you know, I've got lots of little sort of ways of describing it to people to try and explain that there's something in them that's, you know, that's broken, and if they keep feeding it with the dysfunction in their mind, body, and I believe spirit, they get very sick and start to feel like they're dying, you know. And I think it's because you know, the person's in survival mode still, their brain's stuck in that child that's still trying to survive.
Yeah.
And you know, it's you know, it gives the person a lack of safety. They feel disconnected, they're suppressing everything, and you know, healing is the opposite of that. It's presence, connection, and attunement, and these are the conditions that a person has to be in for healing to emerge naturally. That's what I believe about the disease of codependence.
Okay, brilliant, because we'll go into the stages of healing in a minute. I'd love to get your thoughts on that. What are your thoughts, Alistair, on the disease?
Well, I say to people, it's not like a physical disease, but it's like a disease, because, like, you know, anything that happens up to the age of 6, the child has got theta brainwaves going on, you know, so they think everything is their fault, you know, and it allows children to learn a huge amounts of information, like learn 3 languages within 2 or 3 years. When you're 7, you can't learn even 1 more language very easily. So any sort of wound or trauma in that time goes in deep, and the belief the person takes on, like I'm worthless or I can't trust anyone, is really strong. And then out of the millions of bits of information we could be aware of in 1 second, you know, which the subconscious mind is aware of, the conscious mind can only focus on about 50 in 1 second. So we start looking for stuff that fits in with our beliefs. So if I'm worthless, those people laughing over there must be about me, you know, because I'm worthless. So, and I'm not seeing all the rest of the other stuff. So I start finding evidence for what I believe. I create situations then that prove I'm worthless, and then I even start attracting stuff in. So just as an example, I got abandoned as a child quite significantly. I learned to abandon myself looking for love, you know. So the more times I abandon myself thinking I'm worthless and that I've got to not be my real self or I'll be abandoned, it adds to the pool of pain and shame, and so it gets worse and worse and worse. And and it does lead people to kill themselves. Often underneath people's addiction is all this codependency stuff, and people try and fix it through love addiction and love avoidance, sex and love addiction. If I find this person, finally I found mum who's not going to abandon me, but I'll abandon myself to keep hold of her. It causes devastation. So I like to say it's the same as a disease, but it's not necessarily a disease, because it's going to get worse unless you treat it and get help with it.
I think I would say, with this word disease, and I, working specifically in, the trauma and addiction field, it's a debate that comes up a lot with a lot of this stuff. And, I say to people two things. And one of the ways that I talk about codependency is the same way I talk about addiction, which is it's a manifestation of pain. It's a manifestation of trauma. It's something that we experience as a result of what has happened to us. But the other thing that I say about this disease is just think about the word itself, dis-ease, and codependency is a feeling of dis-ease, of not being at ease with oneself. So if we literally break it down like that, then it would make sense to call it a disease. And I kind of try and explain it like in that way to people.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Brilliant. So if you have it, how do you treat it? What are the stages of recovery? Well, let's ask all of you guys first. When did you realize that you had it, and how did you begin your codependency recovery? And then maybe we'll move it to clients. But how did you find out? When did you know? Hilary?
Well, I'd never heard of it. But as I say, I entered into a few of the 12-step fellowships, and I heard this word being kind of bandied about a bit. And my sponsor at the time gave me a book to read about it. And I think I read the first page and I burst into tears and put it on top of my microwave for about a year. And then I got brave and read it again. And I remember crying and crying and crying. And I thought, well, I'll have anything else, but I just don't want this,
Yeah.
And a lot of people sort of snort with laughter about codependency. But it was only years later when I heard the word childhood trauma and developmental trauma that I thought, gosh, it's a real thing. I was sort of relieved really to hear that it came from trauma and that I wasn't just some sort of sort of wuss or sort of arrogant hammer flying through the air. So it was a relief to find out about it. And I worked a program of recovery in a 12-step fellowship for quite some time. I did some therapy, but I have to say it wasn't until I did the survivors work at the Meadows as part of my training that I really got to the depth of the trauma, because I'm quite good at sort of intellectually working my way out of things. So I think a good support network, a good therapist who understands trauma. Many therapists put trauma training on their website. I'm not sure. Look and find out what kind of trauma work they do. It's many and varied. I specialize particularly in Pia Melody's model PIT because it's a model that I'm very comfortable with, but there are many of my fellow professionals, including yourself, and Alistair does other types of things, and Mel, but I like PIT because you go back and take a history of what happened to you, family of origin, debrief. You do inner child work. So that picture I showed you, I externalize those children and work with them, talking to them. this usually frightens the life out of people when I tell them they're going to do this. And, you know, and then we do trauma reduction work. So we bring the people that were offenders in the person's childhood, and we confront them and give back, as Mel was talking about, the carried feelings, the carried shame, the trauma, really, give them back the trauma. It all sounds a bit strange when I describe it like this, but it's a real process. And then continued recovery is to continually work. It's very, very simple. Continually work on the primary symptoms and the secondary symptoms. And doing that brings about an ability to have a relationship with self and others, and be open to the universe helping you.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you. Alistair?
Well, I was working at the Priory North London when Hilary, David and Adela, you know, started doing the workshops. Hilary was the real pioneer in my eyes, and bringing it into this country. And you know, that's where I started hearing this stuff about the relationship with yourself. You know, I'd had some trauma healing. I tried to heal myself rather than get into, you know, as a way of getting into recovery from addiction. It never worked, damn it, you know.
Yeah.
And it was there that, you know, I was struggling, you know, with certain addictive behaviors at times, when, you know, whether it was overworking or whatever. And these kind of really experienced therapists who knew about codependency said, it's not your addiction recovery that's the issue, it's the codependency stuff, Alistair. And then they sent me over to the States to train with Melody. She did the work on me in front of 20 therapists.
Wow, amazing.
And then I went on a 3-day workshop as well for my own healing. And what it, you know, so, you know, because I had such self-esteem issues, I didn't know how critical of myself I was, you know. Once when I was, you know, in my early 20s, I trained to be a Reiki master. And on the way there, I thought, I can't be a Reiki master. I was fully expecting to kind of have a fatal crash on the way there, you know, because surely I couldn't, you know, be of worth. And, you know, that's all been so healed now compared to what it was. But it's the thing I want to underline is, you know, you can have lots of trauma therapy, but if it's not in the context of your relationship with yourself, being a loving parent to yourself, and I believe deep down we have a core, a spiritual core that is whole and untarnished or unwounded by any trauma, and it's kind of connecting to that and healing from that place that it's all about. I'm just so grateful to you, Hilary, and, you know, Melody, for bringing this to my awareness, and now you know, like you say, it's ongoing work on my self-esteem issues, my boundary issues, my knowing and expressing my reality in appropriate ways, self-care. And because it's about my relationship with myself and others, it's never a done job, because I'm still in relationship with myself and others and the universe, or the higher power of my, you know, my understanding.
Yeah.
So
Lovely. Thank you. Mel, when did you get the kind of codependent click?
Yeah, I think for me, again, similar to Hilary, I'd heard it being spoken about in kind of 12-step and, you know, a bit in therapy, and, you know, just sort of, it was just coming, as things tend to do when you need to hear about them, kind of coming into my awareness. And I then got to, I was in a relationship, and another relationship that broke down horrendously in this kind of really catastrophic manner. And I was in recovery at the time, I was in addiction recovery at the time. And I think for me, I kind of had to take a step back and go, well, hang on a minute, all these relationships I have that are ending catastrophically and not working out, the common denominator is me, you know. And before that, it was kind of like pointing the finger and blaming and looking at where other people had been at fault. And I really just had to take that step back and go, no, hang on a sec, I am the one in all these relationships that are failing. And then I kind of took it out a little bit further into looking at friendships and work relationships and relationships with my family. And I'm going, and the penny was dropping, you know, the penny was dropping more and more. And then I read Pia's book. And I sort of said earlier about what my experience was when I read that, which was this real kind of bittersweet. And then I did your workshop, Hilary and Alistair's workshop, which was just, kind of confirmed even more about, the codependency. And for me, one of the ways in which I started my healing from codependency was, touching on what Alistair said, was to work on my relationship with myself. That absolutely had to be, and that was my focus for, I would say, for a good 3 years. I stayed out of, and I'm not saying that this is the way it works for everybody, and it can't work like this for everybody, but I stayed out of romantic relationships for that time. I focused very much on myself. I addressed a lot of the enmeshment that was going on in my family relationships. I put really firm boundaries in place with some of those. I looked at my friendships and where I was kind of acting out in those, or where, certain friendships weren't serving me and why I was staying in them. And it was a real inward, then outward focus. And it's just kind of carried on. And you know what, I am still really on, I was talking to Lou about this the other day, I had a big relapse in my codependency last week, and it really affected me. And it kind of crept up on me, and it was a mixture of lots of things that were going on in my life at that time. So for me, it's constantly a work in progress. And I think the difference is now is, in some ways, it's kind of like, I know it sounds a bit sadistic, but I kind of enjoy it when it happens in some ways, because it reveals another layer to me that needs to be healed. It reveals more to me that I want to work on myself to make things better for me and for those around me.
Thank you. Very honest, as always. Thank you. So what's the difference between or is there one, or is it the same, codependency and compulsive helping?
You answer this, Alistair.
Well, for me, compulsive helping describes part of codependency, so the need to be needed, running around helping everyone else to your own detriment, self-denial or caretaking others, so you keep people too dependent on you. For me, that would be the adapted child in Hilary's drawing there, a survival strategy that someone's learned growing up to parent themselves, so they feel good enough and valuable, through other esteem rather than through self-esteem. So I always say it's part of codependency, but codependency is much wider than that. But I think that's my answer, to be honest. That's what I can say.
No, that's a brilliant answer. I love that. Let's move on to the next one, because that's getting into the meaty nitty gritty. How does codependency affect our adult relationships, and especially our intimacy as well in those relationships, whether it's intimate relationships, I suppose, with friends, or intimate relationships with partners? Hilary, I'm going to let you go first on this one.
Well, I think Pia Melody writes it very simply, just one line. I keep quoting her, my supervisor says to me, you should say Hilary Betts says that, but I think Pia Melody was a real genius, she's really up there with the greats for me, and she was a massive influence, on my own sort of journey of healing, and on my journey as a professional. So I'm hugely grateful to her. And I do like to quote her a lot, and she talks about intimacy being a difficulty sharing who we are with others and hearing who they are, and I think that's such a great and simple description of it. The problem, of course, we've got our cheesy saying that we normally say, and the cheesy saying is "into me see," So that I think is the difficulty. How it happens is that we're in our survival traits, our dysfunctional survival traits, the core symptoms of codependency, the difficulty with the self-esteem, the boundaries, the realities all over the shop, the dependencies all over the shop. We're either a little baby and chaotic, or we're a teenager going around being a control freak. And this leads to the secondary symptoms. And those are you know, getting into negative control issues, getting into resentment, difficulty with our spirituality. We can't ask for help, and these intimacy issues. These are the secondary symptoms, and of course that causes all sorts of problems with relationships. People get into negative control battles with each other. You know, there's the person that's got to be the captain, and somebody's got to be the subordinate, and somebody's got to be enmeshed and clinging on to the relationship, and somebody is usually avoiding the relationship. There's a lack of tea in the relationship. There's a lack of trust in the relationship, and usually, you know, a lot of intensity, drama. There's a new kind of movement in the 12-step fellowships at the moment. There's drama and chaos recovery meetings, and I really like the idea of that. I think it's great because, you know, many people come to me and their relationships read like the script of EastEnders, you know. And you know, I was caught up in this myself, you know, in my own you know, quite a while back now, thankfully past. That, you know, my relationships were, you know, a bit of a disaster area, at times very exciting and intense, but it wasn't about intimacy or love or connection or trust or anything like that at all. So that's the trouble that it causes, codependency.
Whilst you're mentioning drama, whatever happened to the drama triangle? Do you remember the drama Karpman triangle?
I do, yeah.
That used to be quoted
and of course,
around.
Often quoted. Yes, I think it's a great part of it, and Peer Melody teaches it in her training, and in a lot of the work. It's used in a lot of the family work and the addictions and trauma work at the Meadows, for sure.
Right.
And of course it's used in this country across many, and I think it's very helpful. Of course, many people don't understand that there's a reverse to that, which is called the Quimby durable triangle, or the winner's triangle. Some people have never heard of it.
No, I haven't. What's the winner's triangle?
The winner's triangle, well, it uses the P of the persecutor is to persevere with boundaries, and the V of victim is be vulnerable. You know, don't be a victim, be vulnerable with boundaries. And the R of the rescuer is to reach out with boundaries. So it's sort of going the opposite of those. I don't tend to work with that so much, but I do work with helping to see that people are having relationships like teenagers, really. I mean, I work with people who are in their 50s and 60s sometimes, and it's like, you know, it's like a teenager and a 7-year-old, and they're trying to have a relationship. So, you know, and it's only what I had to start with, the basics of understanding about boundaries, about respecting boundaries, not just external ones, sexual, physical, but internal boundaries, and respecting other people's thoughts and what they're saying, and listening to them and trying to get to know them, and then, you know, them practicing listening to me and understanding my reality, and just getting to know each other respectfully and with love. So that's that's the way that I work today.
That's lovely, because I suppose we can't really talk about adult relationships and codependency without talking about boundaries and communication.
Mm. Absolutely.
So, yeah.
Fundamental to all of this, really.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Although much
often,
easier said than done for a codependent to communicate
easier
about
said
needs.
than done.
Yeah.
You know, I still, you know, when I'm setting a boundary with myself or with somebody else, wish that I could ring PM Melody up and say, what do I do? Because it's done sometimes not plumbed in, you know.
Yeah. Just as an aside, where is Pia Melody now? And has she retired?
I believe she has, yes. But she's still very much part of the Meadows.
Is she?
Yes, I believe she is. And I know somebody that was there recently, and they said that she came into the restaurant at lunchtime and was saying hello to everybody.
Oh,
so
that's amazing.
I think she's still a presence there, but I believe she's retired now. Yes.
She's an amazing woman. Yeah. Alistair, where are you on relationships and boundaries and communication?
Well, it links in with the intimacy. So we can have intellectual intimacy where we share thoughts and ideas, emotional intimacy where we know and express our feelings and can receive those of others. We've got physical intimacy where we touch. We've got sexual intimacy if there's a sexual relationship. People are often very good at intellectual intimacy, but not very good at emotional intimacy, because they don't know their reality if they've been traumatized as a kid. They don't know what they think and feel.
Yeah.
You know, and that's where we feel connected with people. By the way, spiritual intimacy is sharing that part of ourselves as well. So if I don't know what I think and feel, I can't have intimacy with you. You know, and knowing my reality and learning to affirm it, this is what I think, this is what I feel, is part of the healing. And that creates the intimacy. And Pia Melody created the talking, you know, I think a lot of her work, she got other stuff and put it all together into a model. And some of it was literally, if you read her book, divinely revealed to her. She was hoovering, she'd get these kind of downloads and write it all down. But the talking, you know, when you're talking to someone, there's a way of doing it called the feedback loop, where you start with observable data. This is what I saw when I saw you do this, when I heard you say that, then your thoughts, this is what I thought about it, and then what that made me feel, and then this is what I prefer, where I say my wants and needs, you know. So that helps have boundaries. And I'm not blaming anyone. If you know, you're not blaming anyone else for your reality when you're doing that. And you can say what you think you need. No, it's not another adult's job to look at to meet my needs and wants. But I still have every right to say them. But then there's a listening boundary. So if you haven't got a functional listening boundary, if someone says something to you, it'll have too much impact on you. So the listening boundary is, I'm thinking to myself when you're talking to me, is it true for me what you're saying? Yes or no? Or maybe, do I need more information? You know, so all these things are really important to have intimacy and communication. But really it's about being able to be your authentic self and be with someone else. So this is me, this is my truth. Speaking the truth without blame or judgment, you know, with love, and then being able to receive someone else's truth and to better protect myself. If someone's offensive, then I need to just, you know, you need to protect yourself and get out of there. There's no point in trying to have intimacy with someone who's on that drama triangle. And by the way, the one thing about the drama triangle I'd like to say, which I learned from this model, is it's a regression. When people are victimizing others as the persecutor, or they're playing the victim role, or they're rescuing, they're not being their authentic selves. It's done out of awareness. It's a regression. It's actually a type of trauma reaction, you know? So if someone's not willing to get off the triangle, I need to extract myself, or my clients need to extract themselves.
Yeah. And not drop back into it being one of those people in the triads either, or in the family too, I guess.
Yeah, and doing those, you know, it's almost like, okay, what you're saying is not acceptable. If you carry on, I'll have to leave. And then the person carries on, then I have to leave. Or maybe they'll say, oh no, I'm really sorry, I was just really stressed, you know, so.
Yeah. Mel, have you got anything to add to that?
No, I don't think so. I think I'm sort of just looking, I'm just looking at the feed in the Facebook group, and just aware that we've got some questions here that I think maybe we should
go for that,
if that's okay with everybody. So as I said, Oriel had a question earlier. She did say that I've kind of answered it. I'm not sure in what part I answered it, but I'm pleased I did. But I just want to read it out anyway, because it might be useful to other people. I think it's quite a good question. And it says, I am used to being codependent, but I am now in a really tricky situation where someone is codependent on me. Any tips, as I can see this will be a real problem when I finally qualify as a counsellor? So yeah, I mean, I think, sorry, just in response to that from me, this is the Oriel, this is what I was talking about being able to flip between the two, you know, going from being the codependent to the counter dependent, depending on, you know, who it is that you're in relationship with at that time and what is going on. For me, it's what's going on internally, for me, in what ways I guess need to, what survival mode I need to go into, you know, because, for example, my abuse was, you know, there was the covert abuse that I had, but I had the overt abuse of the sexual abuse, but then I had a lot of covert abuse, which was very much some of the stuff Alistair was talking about, which was the enmeshment, the being overloved, the worship, and all of that stuff. So for me, depending on what wound is being triggered or was being triggered would depend on what I would go into my codependence or my counter dependence, if you like. And I think really it is about finding that state of interdependence. For me, that's what it was about being able to actually regulate my nervous system, because if I'm going full on into codependency or full on into counter dependency, the reality of it is probably that I'm in some kind of dysregulation in my nervous system. I'm being triggered, my wounds are being activated, and it's about being able to regulate, come back to myself, come back to that place of regulation and of interdependence, and being able to see the reality and being able to switch that prefrontal cortex on and see the situation rationally.
I get it with Oriel, if she's still online, and that at the beginning of our journeys, when we're training, for anybody that's listening that's training as a counsellor or a therapist, I think that codependency needs to be really, really sold to counselling trainees, so that they all really, really understand what it is and how we can recreate it in our clients, and what we need to do, basically, in essence, to not keep the codependency going throughout our career as therapists and healers, in whatever denomination it is, because we in a way, I think, we need to see our clients as whole. We need to see our clients as well. We need to not want them to need us in a way. We need to not be ourselves in our positions as needed, you know. And some people, I mean, you know, if I look back honestly to 20 years ago when I started at the Priory, oh my God, my codependency was horrific. So I'm not saying that you have to have completely healed your codependency to get into this industry and become a therapist, but I think you have to be very mindful that you want your clients or people to attach to you enough that they are doing the neurobiological work that they need for their nervous system, but not so much that they, again, keep, for me, the codependent relationship going, but now with a therapist. That's my 2 pennies. Hilary, Alistair, what do you think on that question? And on therapy and training and being codependent therapists?
Do you want to go first, Alistair?
Well, what I do when there's lots of stuff going on like that in the therapeutic relationship, I start using that feedback loop with the client. And people with a lot of trauma, they literally look like a rabbit in the headlights and start sweating because, you know, they're going one up and one down and having trauma reactions without even really realizing it. And I'm asking them, okay, let's practice having intimacy, you know, where we can say, okay, so when you say that, I think you're trying to get me to look after you, and I feel anxious about that, and what I'd like is for you, you know, so you're really kind of helping them start to be authentic, because when people are being too needy and codependent on me, that's an adaptation. It's like a younger child them in charge or blended with them. So it's about helping them know that. But obviously, if I haven't done enough healing on myself, I might be trying to meet unhealed or unmet needs in me by, you know, having my client really think I'm amazing or something. So really need to have my own therapy, which I have on and off throughout, before, through, and still, you know, at times.
Yeah, thank you.
I think I agree with everything that you've said so far, all of you. I think that working as a trauma therapist with developmental trauma, I'm often with clients who are regressed, they're childlike, and I do feel that sort of being a maternal figure and being a kind of good enough mother to the person in the early stages of their work is part of who I am as a therapist. And I've always tried to be that sort of loving person for them, because they're trusting me hugely.
Yes.
To come in and do this work with me. Often the most horrific things have happened, or they feel absolute shame about the way that they've behaved. But I do believe that one has to do this work oneself on a very, very deep level to be a good practitioner. And rather like Lou was saying, I think I was horrifically codependent, even though I've sort of been doing recovery. You know, I could tell you some really cringy stories, but you know, so you know, it's part of the self-development as a person and as a therapist. But it's really important to get. I mean, that's why I flew to America, because I wanted to go and work with the best, so that I could learn about this. In some of P.O. Melody's literature, she says when we first start doing this work, and she says when you first start doing codependence work, it takes 1 to 2 years to get the hang of all of this, you know, way of looking at it. So it's progress, not perfection. And she says if we're in our functioning adult 60 to 70% of the time, we're doing really well. But if somebody is a therapist and has got untreated codependence, then it really, really blocks the whole therapeutic alliance, and it really stops recovery happening. So I do encourage, Alistair and I have worked with many therapists who've come to us for, you know, just to work on this stuff amongst therapists, and I believe it's the best work you know, that they'll do to be a good resource to their clients.
Yeah, brilliant, thank you. Mel, what are the other questions that we've got?
So we just had Emma was asking what does inner child work mean, but a lot of the group have come back as we've been chatting with some really amazing answers, and I think Emma sort of feels that she's been heard here and answered. So Emma, just to say, if you're still unsure, let us know. We can come back to you in the comments if you still feel there's anything unanswered, but lots of people have given some really great responses. So also for anybody else that was wondering about, you know, answering that question, our incredible community have been really active with helping out with that answer. So thank you, everybody. And Bradley John Riddle, Bradley, I just wanted to acknowledge your comment here, because, you know, I think it's healthy for us to have the debate. And Bradley's just saying feeling ill at ease, in brackets disease, is not a disease. Codependency means an over-reliance on something, prototypically someone, without proper or any boundaries in place. That's also not a disease. When the obsession or preoccupation with calling things, what's the preoccupation or obsession with calling things diseases? Is this a hangover of 12-step ideology, a kind of agonized misplaced loyalty, question mark? So and I think it's an interesting debate. I really
so do I.
And I see both sides of it.
Yeah.
You know, I completely, you know, I've been through periods of time where I have cringed when people have called addiction a disease.
Yeah.
And I've just been like really outwardly vocal about saying, no, it's not. But I think that this is just my very personal opinion, and I'm, you know, don't mean to offend anybody. Sometimes I think, does it really bloody matter? I'm sorry to say, but I kind of feel a lot of the time like, if we just have an understanding of what we're experiencing and we know how to heal it and we find the solution, like, these debates are important, but I don't feel that they're always the most necessary thing to discuss. It's kind of like, what's the experience? What's the solution? Does it matter often what's kind of going on in between, you know, those stages of is it a disease or is it a disorder, or is it that's just my 2 pence worth on it.
Well, what I say is, if it helps you heal from it to call it a disease, call it a disease, and if it doesn't, call it something else, you know.
And if it doesn't help you call it anything, don't call it anything.
Yeah.
Just, you know, don't call it anything. Do whatever really helps you. And I think, you know, labels, names, you know, sometimes, as we were saying earlier, you know, you have one person that can't bear the codependent name or label, or hates the word, and another person who, you know, in my history as a therapist, if I've mentioned codependency and they've looked it up, have been, oh my God, thank you, that explains a set of behaviors that I had no idea about, and I now feel I know I can do something. So I'm with Alistair and Mel, actually. I think use whatever works for you, because we are so individual. What works for somebody else is not going to work for us. So Bradley, if you can't stand the word, don't ever use it. That would be my advice. Hilary, do you have anything to say on that?
I like to tell people about what I believe works, and I haven't just read it out of a book. I've experienced it over the last 2 decades or more, and I've seen other people benefit from it, and so that's what I kind of try and deliver to my clients. And if people don't believe in it, then that I don't try and you know, talk them out of it or anything. I just got asked people to keep an open mind. I have an open mind, you know, if whatever model works for someone, if it brings them to healing. But I don't get into arguments in front of clients about it, or try and put them off a certain model, because I don't know, it might work for them. So I've got my own sort of beliefs about the models that I've used over the years, and I've used them and seen them work with lots of places that I've worked, and you know, and in America. So I've seen the sort of living proof that it does work for some people, and some people it doesn't work for. But I find sometimes the debate can be very off-putting for people who are desperate and seeking for help. So I don't get involved in arguing about it in front of them.
And on that last point, Mel, unless we've got some more questions, the last comment really I was going to make was a little bit on that point, Hilary, is about people that are desperate, although, you know, when we're at the beginning of our journey, or when we're starting codependency recovery, where do we look? Where do we go? And how long realistically does it take? Not the $1 million question then. Alistair, what do you think? Oh, sorry.
Go on, Hilary.
Go on, you go first, Alistair.
Okay, so, well, I think your, this Facebook group is a great resource. It's about, finding community, finding a therapist, getting some recommendations of some therapists as well who specialize in treating trauma. I would check out things like Codependence Anonymous or ACA, Adult Children of Alcoholics and or Dysfunctional Families.
Yeah.
But the healing, to have a healthy relationship with self, there's different stages. So there's healing the wounds, and then more is revealed. So there's a memory I've worked on. We spoke about this on the weekend, I think. There's a memory I've worked on about 10 times with different trauma healing modalities, and recently another bit of it came up, which was probably the deepest part of it, where a belief bomb was formed of all these negative beliefs. And so it's an ongoing healing process. But I don't have those horrendous self-esteem issues that I used to have, because I've done enough of the healing work. But so it doesn't end, I'm afraid. It's that bit of the answer, but it gets easier. And but I can't do it alone. No one can do it alone. We have to be interdependent, so to ask for help and get that help.
Thank you. Brilliant answer. Hilary?
For me, I think the journey began because I was at, something that people call rock bottom. I had, again, another cheesy sort of expression, but it's a true one. I had the gift of desperation, and it's interesting how the sort of universe offers up bits and pieces of help from various places. And I remember watching a therapist on TV that was talking about addiction and codependency. It was a very famous one, was on a breakfast TV show in the 80s. So nowadays, if you're looking for help, we've got the internet and so many resources, and that gift of desperation, that rock bottom, will help you to educate yourself. And a lot of the Meadows and PIT model that I use is all about education. In the beginning, I'm teaching people what I believe is at work in them and what needs to happen to recover. And I think it takes as long as it takes. For me, I'm still working on myself and working on these issues. It really is summed up in for codependence recovery. It's about growing up and becoming more emotionally mature and spiritually mature. And that happens with age, and it happens by working on yourself. And being a loving parent to yourself. So I can still be teenager Hilary. I'm nearly 65, most of the time I'm 65, but I can regress slightly. It's not so bad today, but I love it now. It's learning to be a grown-up has been a great blessing in my life. And working with Alistair and seeing him work as a man on these issues, working alongside him. And it's not all doom and gloom. We sometimes say doom. It's not all doom, gloom, ginger beer and Jesus. It's been fun. We have laughter about it. But I would say in the beginning, it takes a good couple of years to really get this under your belt and start benefiting from PM Melody's model is a healing and reparenting model, and it takes a while to get the hang of that.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, Mel, anything to end up with?
No, I mean, I would just say, first port of call, read PM Melody's basic book. That for me was the real kind of, and then, if you can get a good therapist or do a workshop or, but really, truthfully, whatever way you can find to connect back to your authentic self. This is what I come back to in every aspect of healing, connecting back to yourself so that you can grow in effectiveness in the relationship with yourself before you go and try and experience that outside. Because otherwise, you will just continue to be triggered, and the wounds will never be healed. It's kind of like, you know, taking the plaster off before the cut is quite healed and it opens up again. You know, go and do that work on you, and give yourself, you know, give yourself that.
Lovely. Okay, anything else to answer, or are we okay? All right. Well, from my point of view too, I just want to say thank you to all of you for joining us. And I think it was a brilliant discussion about codependency. And I hope it's really helpful for anybody listening, watching now, watching later, watching wherever you're watching this or hearing us. You know, do come into the Trauma Thrivers group. Hilary's in there, Alistair's in there, Mel's in there, I'm in there. And I'm sure that you can get in touch with them if you want to do any of their trauma healing workshops. I know if you go to traumathrivers.com and look under recommended therapists, they're all on there. And also at the moment, I'm putting up some retreats and workshops. So I know Alistair's is on there and Hilary's soon to be added. So we're all there. If you need anybody, reach out, and in the meantime, have a lovely evening. Thank you for joining us. I really hope it was helpful, and we'll see you next week.
Bye.
All right, take care, everybody.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.